SG-1000. On July 15th, 1983, Sega quietly entered the home console race with the SG-1000, the same day Nintendo dropped the Famicom. Short for Sega Game 1000, this system marked the company's first serious move away from arcades. It featured an 8-bit processor, a growing lineup of cartridge and card-based games, and a joystick-style controller. But there was a problem. It was outdated at launch. While the SG-1000 technically beat Nintendo's system to market and planning, its specs were already underwhelming. Games ran at sluggish frame rates, and the controller was stiff and uncomfortable. Worst of all, Sega released it only in Japan and a few scattered regions, leaving the booming North American market wide open for Nintendo to dominate. Despite these setbacks, the SG-1000 quietly laid the groundwork for Sega's console identity. It was followed by two hardware revisions, the Mark II and Mark III, and proved Sega could ship home hardware. It was just enough to keep Sega in the game at the time, and what came next would set the stage for the company's first real shot at challenging Nintendo's dominance. Sega Master System. After the modest performance of the SG-1000, Sega went back to the drawing board. In 1985, they launched the Sega Mark III in Japan, soon rebranded worldwide as the Sega Master System. This time, they meant business. It boasted superior specs to the Nintendo Entertainment System, a more powerful processor, a broader color palette, and even 3D glasses support. It looked and sounded futuristic, and it had one goal: dethrone Nintendo. But it wasn't that simple. In Japan, the Master System was crushed by the Famicom's dominance. In the US, Sega partnered with Tonka to distribute the console. Yeah, the toy company. That misstep led to weak marketing, poor retail placement, and limited third-party support. Even with classics like Phantasy Star and Alex Kidd, the library couldn't keep up with Nintendo's hold on developers thanks to their restrictive licensing agreements. However, the Master System found an unexpected second life overseas. In Europe and Brazil, the console thrived for years, with new games launching well into the 1990s. In Brazil, it's still sold today under different branding. While it never beat Nintendo at home, the Master System gave Sega valuable global momentum and taught them exactly where they could win next. Sega Genesis. This was it, Sega's real shot. In 1988, the Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive, as it was known outside North America, launched with the confidence of a company that had learned from its past. It was sleek, 16-bit, and arcade accurate. With titles like Altered Beast and Golden Axe, Sega leaned into its arcade roots hard. But the real breakout moment came in 1991, when Sonic the Hedgehog dropped. Suddenly, Sega was cooler than Nintendo. Sega's marketing went on the offensive. Their edgy ads, celebrity endorsements, and fast-paced games turned the Genesis into a cultural force, especially in the US. And with strong third-party support from studios like Treasure and Technosoft, its library quickly became a powerhouse of action, sports, and platforming hits. Still, it wasn't a total landslide. The SNES eventually gained ground with technical advantages like Mode 7 and stronger RPG support. But by the early 90s, Sega had done the unthinkable. They made the console war real. For the first time ever, Nintendo was stunned. The Genesis was a hit. I'll be posting new videos every day, so if you've enjoyed this one so far, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now on to the next section. Sega CD. By the early 90s, Sega was feeling unstoppable, and maybe a bit too confident. Next came the Sega CD in 1991, a bold, expensive add-on for the Genesis meant to leap into the CD-ROM era. With flashy full-motion video, CD-quality audio, and promises of groundbreaking gameplay, the Sega CD looked like the future. But it launched with a thud. The add-on retailed for a steep $299, not including the Genesis itself. For that price, early adopters got grainy video games like Night Trap and Sewer Shark, which looked impressive in ads but played more like interactive cutscenes. Sega's marketing overhyped the experience, leading to inevitable disappointment. There were a few gems: Sonic CD, Lunar Eternal Blue, and Snatcher. Besides those, most of the library felt rushed or gimmicky. Worse, the hardware was bulky and fragile. Two different models confused consumers, and the installation process was anything but plug and play. Developers didn't know what to make of it, and many stayed away. Still, the Sega CD wasn't a total waste. It introduced ideas that would shape future gaming, like expanded storage and cinematic storytelling, but it also marked the beginning of Sega's hardware misfires, innovative but poorly executed, overpriced, and too far ahead of its time. Sega 32X. The Sega 32X was a panic move. Released in late 1994, the 32X was a mushroom-shaped plug-in that turned your Genesis into a 32-bit system. On paper, it sounded like a great bridge between the aging Genesis and the upcoming Saturn. In reality, it was a disaster. First off, timing couldn't have been worse. The Saturn was already being hyped, and developers were focusing their efforts there. Consumers were left wondering, why buy an expensive add-on for a console that was about to be replaced? The 32X launched at $159, but by the time many even considered it, it was already in bargain bins. SEGA themselves slashed prices to try and clear stock. The library was painfully thin. There were only about 40 games total, most of them ports or half-baked experiments. Knuckles, Chaotix, and Doom were standouts, but they couldn't justify the hardware. Worse, using the 32X with the SEGA CD required a tangled mess of wires, multiple power bricks, and tech gymnastics just to get it working. The 32X confused the market, and that confusion would haunt SEGA during the launch of its next big bet, SEGA Saturn. In 1994, SEGA launched the Saturn in Japan with high hopes, but behind the scenes, panic was brewing. Sony was entering the console race with the PlayStation, and SEGA knew they had to move fast. The Saturn was promising with its dual CPUs, advanced 2D capabilities, and arcade-perfect ports like Virtua Fighter, but its architecture was notoriously difficult to develop for, and 3D performance lagged behind Sony's simpler, more efficient PlayStation hardware. The Saturn's US launch became one of the most infamous in gaming history. At E3 1995, SEGA shocked retailers and developers by announcing the system was available immediately, months ahead of schedule. Instead of building hype, it sparked chaos. Key retailers like Walmart were left out of the early launch and fought back by dropping SEGA entirely. Developers had no time to finish games, and the launch lineup was bare bones at best. Despite strong early sales in Japan and some killer exclusives like Night into Dreams or Shining Force 3, the Saturn never gained momentum in the West. The PlayStation crushed it in third-party support, pricing, and consumer trust. By 1998, the Saturn was dead, and Sega's image was in freefall. SEGA Dreamcast. The SEGA Dreamcast launched in Japan in 1998, then in North America in 1999. For a brief moment, it felt like SEGA was back. It was the first 128-bit system, with a built-in modem, a visual memory unit that acted as a second screen, and an arsenal of solid launch titles. Sonic Adventure, Soul Calibur, and NFL 2K showed off the system's technical leap and creative edge. It was affordable, easy to develop for, and beloved by early adopters. But even with its head start on Sony and Microsoft, the Dreamcast couldn't outrun Sega's past. Many retailers and consumers still remembered the burned promises of the 32X and Saturn. Third-party publishers hesitated, and major players like EA refused to support the system altogether. Piracy also ran rampant. Dreamcast games were very easy to burn. Despite being profitable and critically adored, the Dreamcast was discontinued in 2001. It sold over 9 million units, not a failure by raw numbers, but not enough to sustain Sega's hardware business. The Dreamcast went out with a cult following, and a legacy of what could have been. Genesis Mini. After years away from the hardware spotlight, Sega returned in 2019 with the Genesis Mini, part of the retro mini console trend sparked by Nintendo's NES Classic. But unlike Sega's earlier plug-and-play attempts, most of which were outsourced and poorly received, the Genesis Mini was done right. This time, Sega took full control of the hardware, partnering with M2 for emulation, a studio known for near-perfect retro ports. The Genesis Mini came packed with 42 games, including beloved classics like Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Streets of Rage 2, and Gunstar Heroes. Even some rare surprises made it in, like Monster World 4. The menus were slick, the emulation was sharp, and the attention to detail won over critics and fans. Priced competitively at $79.99, it stood tall next to Nintendo's offerings, and many fans considered it the definitive way to experience the Genesis in the modern era. It didn't signal a comeback for Sega hardware, but it was a love letter to the fans, and proof that when Sega takes its time, it can still deliver magic. Game Gear Micro. In 2020, to celebrate its 60th anniversary, Sega did something unexpected. It released the Game Gear Micro, a miniature version of its early 90s handheld. But instead of riding the retro wave like the Genesis Mini, this launch left fans scratching their heads. Each Micro was only about 3 inches wide, so small that the screen was barely usable without squinting. And instead of one system with a full library, Sega released 4 different models, each preloaded with just 4 unique games. If you wanted all 16 games, you had to buy all 4 micro consoles, about $50 each. Worse, they were only officially released in Japan. International fans could import them, but the value proposition was murky. The novelty factor was there, and the packaging was charming, but it felt more like a collector's gag than a true product launch. To be fair, the Game Gear Micro wasn't meant to revive handheld gaming. It was more of a tribute to Sega's past. But after the goodwill of the Genesis Mini, many fans hoped for a real return to form. Instead, they got one of the strangest and tiniest console launches ever made. Sega's downfall. Sega's exit from the console business wasn't caused by one bad decision. It was death by 1,000 cuts. The seeds were planted as early as the Sega CD and 32X, when the company began fragmenting its audience with expensive, short-lived add-ons. Then came the rushed launch of the Saturn, which burned retailers and confused consumers. By the time the Dreamcast arrived, Sega had already lost trust, and trust is everything in gaming. Internally, Sega was a mess. The US and Japanese divisions clashed constantly, each pushing different strategies and hardware plans. Development was chaotic, marketing was inconsistent, and key partnerships, like with EA, collapsed. Even when Sega made something incredible, like the Dreamcast, the company's reputation couldn't recover. Retailers were cautious, developers were hesitant, and consumers had already shifted their eyes to the looming PlayStation 2. In 2001, Sega officially announced it would stop making consoles. It was a shocking end for a company that had once led the industry in innovation and style. Sega transitioned into a third-party developer, where it still lives today. But its fall from hardware grace remains one of the most dramatic stories in gaming history. What was your favorite Sega console? Leave a comment down below. Thanks for watching.